I remember looking out over the empty football field and thinking how the silence of a stadium at night is different from any other kind of quiet. It is an expectant silence, like thousands of people are holding their breath in the dark stands, waiting for a play that will never happen. I had gone back up to the press box because I realized I had left my specialized camera lens on the counter after covering the evening's high school rivalry game. The stadium lights had been killed 20 minutes prior, leaving only the dim, amber glow of the distant streetlights to wash over the turf. I climbed the narrow, rusted metal ladder that clung to the side of the concrete pillar, my keys jingling against my thigh with every step. When I reached the top and unlocked the heavy steel door of the observation booth, I felt a brief sense of relief at the sight of my expensive equipment sitting exactly where I had left it. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a heavy, pressurized thud that echoed through the hollow structure. I didn't think anything of it at first, as the latch was sturdy and the room was designed to be soundproof for the announcers. But as I turned to leave, my hand grasping the cold industrial handle, I realized the mechanism didn't just resist me. It felt completely disconnected. I pulled harder, my boots bracing against the floor, but the handle spun loosely in a full circle, making a dry, grinding sound that made my stomach drop into my shoes. I pressed my face against the thick plexiglass window that overlooked the field, wondering if a student had played a prank on me or if the old hardware had finally given up. That was when I looked down at the base of the tower and saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The long, telescopic ladder I had just climbed was no longer leaning against the pillar. It was lying flat on the grass 50 feet below, looking like a discarded toothpick in the moonlight. My heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I realized I was trapped in a glass and steel box 40 feet above the ground with no way down and no one left in the park. I reached for my phone, but the screen remained black, a victim of a dead battery I had neglected to charge during the game. I was alone, suspended in the air, but as I scanned the dark perimeter of the track, I realized that alone was a luxury I no longer possessed. A faint crackle of static erupted from the stadium's public address system, a sound so sudden and jarring in the midnight still that I nearly fell backward into the desk. It was followed by a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone tapping a finger against a microphone head to check the connection. My eyes darted across the field, searching for the source, until I saw a flicker of movement near the 50-yard line. A figure was standing there, dressed in a dark, hooded tracksuit that blurred into the shadows of the turf. They weren't moving toward the booth. They were just standing perfectly still, looking up at me. Then, a voice boomed through the massive stadium speakers, distorted and metallic, echoing off the empty bleachers with a terrifying authority. "Welcome to the post-game show," the voice said, the tone mockingly cheerful yet devoid of any real humanity. "Our guest tonight seems to be looking for an exit, but the defense has closed all the gaps." I backed away from the window, my mind racing through every possible escape route, but the press box was a fortress of reinforced glass and metal. I began to sweat despite the air-conditioned chill of the small room, my eyes searching for a tool, a heavy object, or a way to trigger the fire alarm. The voice on the speakers continued, narrating my movements with a chilling accuracy that told me they were watching me through binoculars or perhaps a camera I hadn't noticed. "He's moving to the back corner now," the voice echoed, the sound vibrating through the very floorboards beneath my feet. "It looks like he's searching for a weapon, but we all know that the clock is ticking down, and he's out of timeouts." I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I realized this person wasn't just a random vandal. They were treating my genuine terror as a scripted event for their own amusement. I grabbed a heavy metal tripod and swung it with all my might against the plexiglass, but the material was designed to withstand stray balls and high winds, and it didn't even chip. The figure on the field began to walk slowly toward the base of my tower, their footsteps invisible but their progress marked by the shifting shadows. A bold attempt at a breakout. The announcer's voice crackled, followed by a low, buzzing laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "But the walls are thick, and the night is long, and no one is coming to save the home team tonight." I looked at the door again, desperate to find a way to re-engage the latch, but the internal screws had been filed down, meaning someone had tampered with this long before I ever stepped inside. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a trap that had been set and baited, and I had walked right into it. I began to scream for help, my voice cracking as I projected toward the distant houses beyond the stadium fence. But the announcer simply turned up the volume on the PA system, playing a recording of a roaring crowd that drowned out my cries. The wall of artificial sound was deafening, a cacophony of whistling and cheering that mocked my isolation. I watched as the figure reached the base of the tower and disappeared from my line of sight, meaning they were now directly beneath me, where I could no longer see what they were doing. The stadium lights suddenly flickered on, not at full power, but in a strobing, erratic pattern that turned the world into a series of jagged, terrifying snapshots. In one flash, I saw the figure beginning to spray something onto the concrete pillar. In the next, they were gone again. I realized then that they weren't trying to get in. They were waiting for me to become so desperate that I would try to jump. The pressure is mounting. The voice boomed over the fake crowd noise. Will he take the leap, or will he wait for the final whistle? I knew that jumping from this height onto the concrete below would be fatal or leave me shattered and helpless on the ground. I noticed a small maintenance hatch in the ceiling, a square panel used to access the wiring for the roof-mounted speakers. It was my only hope, though it led to a narrow ledge with no railing. I dragged the heavy desk toward the center of the room, my muscles aching from the strain, and piled my equipment bags on top of it to create a makeshift platform. The voice on the speaker seemed to grow agitated, the play-by-play becoming faster and more aggressive. He's going off script, folks. He's trying to exit through the rafters. I ignored the booming echoes and pushed against the hatch with all my strength. It creaked, resisted, and then popped open, showering me with dust and dead insects. I hauled myself up into the dark crawl space, my fingers catching on sharp metal edges, until I was huddled on the flat, gravel-covered roof of the press box. From up here, the wind whipped at my hair, and I could see the hooded figure standing back out on the track, looking up with a silhouette that appeared sharpened by the strobing lights. They looked frustrated, the megaphone in their hand dropping to their side as they realized I had found a way out of the glass cage. I saw a thick television cable that ran from the roof of the booth down to a secondary lighting pole, and from there, it sloped toward the top of the bleachers. It was a terrifying, narrow path, but it was the only way that didn't involve a vertical drop. I gripped the cable, the black rubberized coating cold and slick under my palms, and began to slide myself across, my legs dangling over the abyss. The announcer's voice returned one last time, no longer mocking, but filled with a cold, quiet hissed threat. The game isn't over until I say it's over. I heard the sound of the metal ladder being dragged across the concrete below, the figure moving to intercept where the cable met the stands. I moved with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled speed I didn't know I possessed, my hands burning as I friction slid down the line. I hit the top row of the aluminum bleachers with a bone-jarring thud, stumbling and rolling down the metal stairs just as the figure rounded the corner of the stands. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the darkness of the concourse, scaling the outer perimeter fence and landing hard on the asphalt of the parking lot. I ran until I reached the main road, flagging down a passing patrol car with my shirt torn and my hands bleeding. I survived the night, but even now, when I pass the stadium and see those high, dark windows of a press box, I can still hear the faint static of a microphone turning on in the dark. The hospital basement always felt like a place where time went to die, but that night, the silence was heavier than usual. I was down in the medical archives, a windowless labyrinth of sliding steel shelves and yellowing paper records that smelled of dust and old ink. My task was simple enough. I had to locate a set of physical files from the late 80s that hadn't been digitized yet for a legal review. The lights in the archives were motion-activated and flickered with a sickly, fluorescent hum that made the shadows between the tall rows of shelves seem to stretch and yawn. I finally found the correct aisle, pulling a heavy box from the top shelf, when the air in the room suddenly changed. There was a sharp, metallic click from the far end of the room, followed by the heavy, unmistakable sound of the motorized fire door sealing shut. This wasn't a standard drill. The emergency lights didn't come on, and the main overhead stayed dark, leaving me in a claustrophobic dimness that felt like being buried alive. I dropped the box and ran toward the exit, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I grabbed the industrial handle of the fire door and pulled, but it was locked tight by the building's central security override. I pounded on the thick metal, the sound echoing flatly against the concrete walls. But I knew that this deep underground, no one would hear me over the hum of the hospital's massive ventilation system. I stood there for a moment, trying to slow my breathing, telling myself it was just a technical glitch or a system error. That was when I heard the sound of something sliding across the floor on the other side of the door. It was a soft, scraping noise, followed by a faint, wet slap of paper hitting the linoleum. I looked down at the narrow gap at the base of the door, and my breath hitched in my throat. A single, glossy photograph had been pushed through the crack. I picked it up with trembling fingers, my eyes widening as I recognized the image. It was a high-resolution shot of me, taken from a distance. I was in my own kitchen, standing at the sink with my back to the window, completely unaware that someone was watching me from the darkness outside. My hands began to shake so violently that the photo nearly slipped from my grip. How could someone have this? I turned the photo over, and in neat, cramped handwriting, someone had written, "You look so much more peaceful when you think you're alone." A cold wave of terror washed over me, a realization that this wasn't a malfunction. I wasn't just trapped. I was being hunted by someone who had been studying my life for a very long time. I backed away from the door, retreating into the maze of shelves, my eyes searching for any kind of weapon or a way out. The archive room was a dead end, a concrete box designed to keep fire out, which now meant it was perfectly designed to keep me in. I heard a soft tapping on the metal door, a rhythmic, playful sound that seemed to mock my fear. "I know you're in there, Sarah," a muffled voice whispered from the hallway. It was low and distorted, making it impossible to tell if it belonged to a man or a woman, but the intimacy of the tone made my skin crawl. "I've waited 3 months for the security schedule to align just right. You always stay late on Thursdays. You're so predictable, it's almost heartbreaking." I scrambled deeper into the archives, moving toward the very back where the oldest records were kept. I found a heavy metal cart used for transporting files and pushed it in front of the aisle, creating a small barricade. My mind was racing, trying to remember if there was a secondary exit or a service hatch. Then, another photograph slid under the door, followed by another and another. They came in quick succession, like a deck of cards being dealt. I crawled forward to see them, driven by a morbid, terrifying curiosity. Each photo was more invasive than the last. One was of me sleeping. Another was of me at the grocery store. The third was a photo of the very archive room I was standing in, taken from the perspective of the ventilation grate in the ceiling. I looked up, my eyes straining to see into the darkness of the ceiling tiles. The grate was directly above the center of the room, and as I stared at it, I saw a faint glint of glass, a camera lens tucked behind the metal slats. They weren't just outside the door. They had been watching me from above the entire time. The realization that I was being toyed with like an insect in a jar sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I couldn't just wait for them to decide when the game was over. I needed to find a way to signal for help, but the walls were reinforced concrete and my cell phone signal was non-existent this deep in the basement. The tapping on the door stopped, replaced by the sound of a key turning in a lock. The person outside had a master bypass key. The heavy motor of the fire door began to groan as the seal broke, and the door started to slide open, inch by agonizing inch. I knew I had seconds before they stepped into the room. I looked at the massive, mobile shelving units, the kind that sit on tracks and move when you turn a large wheel at the end of the row. An idea, desperate and dangerous, flashed through my mind. I grabbed the wheel of the unit I was standing next to and began to spin it with every ounce of strength I had, opening a gap between two of the heaviest shelves. As the fire door fully opened, a shadow stepped into the room, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway. They were wearing a dark jumpsuit and a surgical mask, holding a heavy industrial flashlight that they began to sweep across the rows of files. I stayed silent, tucked into the narrow gap I had created, my heart thumping so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "Sarah? Come out! Sarah?" the voice said, sounding almost disappointed. "Don't make this difficult. We have so much to talk about, and the night is almost over." They began to walk down the main aisle, the beam of their flashlight cutting through the dust motes like a blade. As they passed the row where I was hiding, I waited until their back was turned. I stepped out from the shadows and threw a heavy stack of medical binders toward the far corner of the room. The loud crash drew them instantly, and as they turned their head toward the noise, I lunged for the fire door. They realized the trick almost immediately and began to sprint toward me, their heavy boots thudding on the floor. I reached the door just as they were a few feet away, but I didn't try to run into the hallway. Instead, I grabbed the manual override lever on the inside of the door frame, the one meant for emergency closures. I slammed the lever down and threw myself out into the hallway just as the heavy steel door began to hiss shut with a powerful hydraulic force. The intruder tried to wedge their arm through the gap, but the mechanism was built to seal against extreme heat and pressure, and it didn't stop. I heard a muffled cry of pain and a dull thud as they were forced to pull back to avoid being crushed. The door sealed with a heavy, final click, locking the intruder inside the very vault they had tried to trap me in. I didn't wait to see if the lock would hold. I ran for the stairs, my lungs burning, and didn't stop until I burst through the main lobby and into the arms of the night security guard. When the police finally opened that door an hour later, the room was empty, but the ventilation grate in the ceiling had been ripped open, leaving behind only a pile of photographs and a handwritten note that said, "See you at home." I moved across the country the next day, but every time I hear a door click shut, I still find myself looking up at the ceiling, waiting for the flash of a lens. I had always thought that the heavy, reinforced steel of the safe room door was a symbol of my absolute security, but tonight, it feels like the lid of a coffin. I remember the moment the alarm tripped. It wasn't a loud, blaring siren, but a subtle, persistent chime on my phone that indicated a perimeter breach at the back of the estate. I didn't hesitate, because my husband had spent a fortune on this house precisely for its impenetrable features. I ran into the master suite, stepped into the walk-in closet, and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner hidden behind a row of winter coats. The heavy panel slid back with a hiss of pressurized air, and I stepped into the cold, gray sanctuary of the safe room, sealing the door behind me with a motorized thud that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. I was safe, or so I told myself, as I sat on the small bench and watched the bank of security monitors that flickered to life on the far wall. The cameras showed the hallway I had just fled, empty and bathed in the eerie, blue light of the emergency system. Then the first shadow appeared. It wasn't a hulking figure or a group of masked men. It was a single person, dressed in a tactical vest, moving with a terrifying professional stillness. They didn't go for the jewelry box or the safe in the office. They walked straight to the closet door and placed a hand on the surface where the scanner was hidden. I watched the monitor, my breath hitching in my throat, waiting for them to realize they were locked out. But they didn't look frustrated. Instead, they pulled a small, portable speaker from their pocket and placed it against the steel door. A second later, a voice filled the safe room, coming not from the speakers of the monitor, but from the ventilation shaft above my head. "I know you're in there, Claire," the voice said, sounding unnervingly calm. "And I know you think that 4 inches of hardened steel is enough to keep the world away, but you've forgotten one very important thing about airtight rooms." I looked up at the ceiling, my eyes narrowing as I tried to understand what they meant. The safe room had its own independent oxygen supply, a series of tanks tucked away behind the wall panels, designed to last for 72 hours. I checked the digital gauge on the wall, and my heart skipped a beat. The oxygen levels were dropping not slowly, but in a rapid, plummeting descent that shouldn't have been possible. "You see, Claire," A safe room is only safe if the systems that run it are protected. The voice continued, the tone almost educational. But your husband hired the lowest bidder for the HVAC integration, and I've been sitting in your basement for the last 3 hours, rerouting the intake valves. I realized then that they weren't trying to break the door down. They were simply going to wait for the air to run out until I was forced to open the door myself. I grabbed the emergency landline to call the police, but as I lifted the receiver, all I heard was the same calm voice on the other end. The lines are cut, Claire. And the cellular jammer I've placed in the hallway means your little SOS button is just a plastic toy right now. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my neck, the air in the room already feeling thick and heavy, though I knew part of it was my own mounting panic. I looked at the monitors again and saw the intruder sitting down on the floor right outside the door, crossing their legs as if they were waiting for a movie to start. They weren't even looking at the cameras. They were looking at a stopwatch. The curiosity of why they were doing this began to gnaw at me more than the fear. They hadn't asked for money. They hadn't asked for the code to the floor safe. Why are you doing this? I screamed at the wall, knowing the internal microphones would carry my voice to them. There was a long silence, and then the speaker crackled again. Because you have something that doesn't belong to you, Claire. A file your husband took from the firm 2 years ago. He thinks it's hidden, but we know it's in that room with you, stored in the physical backup drive beneath the floorboards. I looked down at my feet. I didn't even know there was a backup drive. I was a prisoner in a room full of secrets I didn't understand, being suffocated by a ghost from my husband's past. As the air grew thinner, my head began to throb, a dull, pulsing ache that made it hard to focus on the monitors. The intruder stood up and tapped on the door. 10% oxygen remaining, Claire. Your lungs are going to start burning soon. Your vision will blur. You'll feel a strange sense of euphoria right before you slip into a coma. I knew I had to do something, but the room was a literal dead end. I looked around the small space, my eyes landing on the fire extinguisher mounted near the door. It was a standard CO2 model designed to smother flames, but I remembered something my father had taught me about pressure and seals. The safe room door operated on a hydraulic seal that required a specific amount of back pressure to remain locked. If I could disrupt the sensor at the base of the frame, the system might default to an emergency release mode to prevent occupants from being trapped during a mechanical failure. I crawled to the door, my movements sluggish and heavy, and wedged the nozzle of the fire extinguisher into the tiny drainage gap at the bottom of the frame. I took a deep breath of the stale, thinning air and squeezed the trigger. The white, freezing cloud of CO2 hissed into the gap, the extreme cold instantly frosting the metal and, more importantly, triggering the thermal sensors in the door's computer. The intruder jumped back as the alarm finally began to blare, a high-pitched, screeching sound that signaled a system malfunction. "What are you doing?" The voice shouted, no longer calm, but filled with a sudden, sharp edge of panic. The internal computer, sensing a fire and a seal breach simultaneously, initiated the fail-safe protocol. The heavy steel bolts ground backward with a scream of complaining metal, and the door swung open 6 inches. I didn't wait for it to open all the way. I threw the heavy fire extinguisher at the gap, jamming it between the door and the frame so it couldn't close again. The intruder was right there, reaching for the handle, but I didn't try to fight them. I grabbed the heavy, industrial-sized canister of bear spray I kept in the safe room's emergency kit and unleashed a thick, orange cloud of pepper resin directly into the hallway. The intruder staggered back, coughing and blinded, as the chemicals filled the narrow corridor. I shoved past them, my lungs screaming for the fresh air of the house, and sprinted toward the kitchen. I didn't stop to look back. I grabbed the heavy butcher's knife from the block as I ran past, burst through the back French doors, and didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's gate, screaming for them to call the authorities. When the police arrived, the house was silent, the intruder gone, leaving behind only the empty speaker and a half-opened floorboard in the safe room. I never went back into that room again, and I never asked my husband what was on that drive. Some doors are meant to stay closed, but some secrets are meant to be buried even deeper.